Hi, and welcome to another episode of Hot Takes with me, the Silver Fox. The Scottish Prison Service has a problem. Freedom of information requests have shown that 60% of trans prisoners only identified as trans after being sentenced. To any casual observer, this would suggest they're not so much trans as scared of going into a male prison. And that's not a surprise, because 60% of trans prisoners are inside because they committed sexual offences, and so locking them up in a jail with vulnerable women is not so much a punishment as a reward. Now, it doesn't help that the new Deputy First Minister, Shona Robertson, is someone who is pushing the Gender Act and actually voted down safeguards for such eventualities as locking men with a history of sexual offences in a prison with women. She voted it down and removed the rights, freedoms and safety for women. She is directly responsible for putting vulnerable women in prison in harm's way. This is who the Deputy First Minister is. A woman herself who cares not one jot about the safety of other women. So what is to be done? We're going to take a look at this article and see what is going on in the Scottish Prison Service and how, if anything, it can be sorted out. Here goes. So, over 6 in 10 transgender prisoners transitioned after being jailed. Over 6 in 10 transgender prisoners in Scotland started to identify as the opposite gender after they were imprisoned. This is confirming the fears of some that dangerous criminals are using the country's leftist gender policies to game the criminal justice system. It's something that we said all along. It's something this channel has said all along, that these prisoners are so unlikely to actually be trans because it's such a rare condition, and it does need psychiatric evaluation. You can't just say you are, but under Scotland's rules, yes you can. And so you're getting dangerous, predatory men being locked up with women, and I think the banners and things here, only men can be trans women, no males in female jails, and I think that's what just about every normal, right-minded, decent human being thinks. It's just these leftist weirdos who keep standing for the SNP think otherwise. It's a form of Marxism that destroys the rights and freedoms and ultimately the safety of women. Freedom of information requests have revealed that as of last month, there were a total of 19 prisoners identifying as transgender in the Scottish prison system. Out of these, 12, 63%, began to claim to be transgender after they were locked up. And according to a report from the UK's Telegraph newspaper, 7 prisoners were classified as transgender women, meaning they were born as biological males and therefore were allowed to serve their sentences in a female-only prison. The figures have confirmed the minds of opponents of allowing biological males into female prisons as proof that criminals are taking advantage of the system by claiming to be transgender and therefore avoid the rigours of the male prison system. And of course, that's exactly what it is. We've said this from day one. It's always going to be there. If you leave someone a loophole, they will jump through it. And these men are going in and they're either going to be having access to vulnerable women, or they're at the very least, they're doing it to get an easier time and face less retribution, shall we say, from hardened criminals, from men who would take exception to some of the crimes that these men have committed, particularly the ones involving children. In a male prison, you don't last long. If you're in Gen Pop, if you're someone who's done that, you have to be sectioned because they know that that even within the criminal classes, people have often a sense of decency. Yes, there are going to be people in there who've done various crimes, robbery, theft, fraud, that kind of thing. But when you put someone in that's done those sort of things, particularly children, they take great exception. And remember that these are prisoners. They're not men who will necessarily stick by the rules at the best of times. So you can guarantee that retribution will follow if it's available. And that is why so many of these men that commit these crimes want to identify as women. They go into jail. They have an easier time. And it is completely wrong. Or the Alba Party MP, Kenny McCaskill, who previously served as the locally devolved SNP government's Justice Secretary, said this is far from reassuring and confirms that self-ID is being used to avoid going to male prisons by male prisoners. who have convictions for very serious crimes. And the revelations come after the Scottish Government's transgender policy drew international backlash, which ultimately forced far-left First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to resign, amongst other reasons, of course, although she's completely innocent of all charges and the police investigation will undoubtedly come to nothing. Anyway, she was unable to say whether Adam Graham was a woman or not, and it's very easy. Open the front of the pants, look down. That tells you all you need to know. He began to identify as a woman named Isla Bryson, but only after being put on trial for R-ing two women. Graham, who was later sentenced to 8 years in prison, which is a terribly low amount of time for committing 2 R's. It should be at least the rest of his life, and preferably a week in prison, followed by a very short journey down a little hole while holding onto a piece of rope with his neck. That's probably the best sort of thing, because if you do that, there's no recidivism, there's no coming back. They don't tend to commit too many crimes after that particular punishment. Graham, who was later sentenced to 8 years in prison, was initially set to serve out his term in a women's jail, despite never receiving a legal gender transition certificate. However, following the intense backlash, the leftist separatist government decided to backtrack on the decision, and they sent him to a male prison. And it's easy to work this out. You extract a bit of blood, do a DNA test, and whatever the result is, male or female, that's the prison you go to. It makes no odds what these individuals think, want, or desire. It's who they are, and he is male, and he will always be male, and so he goes to a male prison. It's as simple as that. If he's still got his tackle, he definitely goes to a male prison. The Scottish Prison Service also went on to pause the Sturgeon-era policy of allowing prisoners to self-identify with the gender of their preference. However, the final policy is yet to be announced, and prisoners are still able to be transferred to female prisons following a review process, which is completely wrong. If you've still got your tackle, if you've still got the meat and 2 veg in your pants, you ain't never to go to a female prison. You cannot put predatory men in rooms with women. Attempting to downplay the figures, the chief executive of the Scottish Prison Service, Theresa Medder, said that out of the 7 biological males placed in female prisons as of last month, only 4 had actually been convicted of a crime, and that the others were being held on remand during their trial. That's immaterial. That means nothing. The fact is, you've got men locked up with women, and that is wrong. There have long been concerns that dangerous criminals would try to take advantage of woke ideology in prisons. For example, in 2015, the then president of the British Association of Gender Identity Specialists, Dr. James Barrett, warned that there is a plethora of prison intelligence suggesting that the driving force behind biological male sex offenders claiming to be women was to make subsequent sexual offending very much easier. The case of Adam Graham is by far not the first instance of a British government placing dangerous sex offenders in the company of female prisoners because they identified as transgender. In the notable expose, convicted Ara of women Karen White, born Stephen Wood, assaulted several female prisoners shortly after being transferred to a women's prison. And commenting on the issue, Scottish Tory member of the Scottish Parliament, Russell Findlay, said that the majority of these prisoners decided to transition only after being sent to prison. It's of obvious suspicion and concern. Well, of course it is, and it's happening. And all these people say, oh, this never happens, or, oh no, they're genuinely women. There's examples there of men committing these kind of crimes in prison against vulnerable women simply because somebody in authority has been stupid enough to do this, or naive enough to do this, or possibly evil enough to do this. It needs to be found out. Whoever locks a man up with women needs immediately to lose their job. And any offences committed by that man against those women, that person needs to stand in the dock, because that person is as guilty as the person committing them, because that person enabled it. And if someone, R's a woman in a prison, the person responsible for putting that man in that prison needs to stand beside him in the dock and get prosecuted for the same crime. And that, I think, once a few of them happen, there'll be very, very few people, men, being sent to women's prisons, knowing that the person who signs off on it will also go to prison when he commits his next crime. That is how bad it is. Anyway, Russell Findlay went on to say that following the Isla Bryson and Tiffany Scott scandals, the SNP should deliver their transgender prison review as soon as possible. A fundamental consideration must be the motivation of those claiming to be transgender and the potential impact on female prisoners, many of whom are vulnerable and have suffered from male aggression, let's just say. And he's quite right. You cannot, any human being who is normal, any human being who is right-minded would understand that you cannot let men go into female prisons because the threat alone is way too high. And yet these people are doing it. It makes you wonder about their motivation for doing it and indeed their humanity. And so the fact that Shona Robinson actually voted down to make an exception for male prisoners going into female jails shows how little humanity that monster has. Anyway, I shall round off, come up and we'll finish the video. How can anyone ever think that this is right? No matter what these strange men want, whatever their desires, whatever their beliefs, they are men. They were born men, they are men, and they will always be men. They can put on women's clothes, they can give themselves a nice new name, but they're still biologically male. They have that male strength and those male desires. They have the ability to impose their will, especially on vulnerable women who, when they're locked in a cell overnight with them. Nobody is safeguarding these women, and people are making the decision that it is acceptable to do this because they don't want to be seen as being an ist or a phobe, but they end up being complicit in harming women. It is wrong, and the simplest of tests means that you go to the prison of your sex, not your gender. It's as simple as that. And if that is brought in, then there'll be a lot fewer transgender men in prison with women. Because the moment they get to prison, it's like, oh yes, you're a man, and it doesn't matter what you're wearing or what you call yourself. You're biologically male. You go to a man's prison. Anyway, I shall stop now. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got to the end of this one, thank you very much. If you like what you're seeing here on the channel, please hit that subscribe button right away. Ring that bell for notification of future outputs. Leave a like, leave a comment. Please, please, please share the video. And until next time, stay safe, stay well, stay out of prison, and goodbye.